Church family, thanks so much for joining us this morning for a daily devotional. We're continuing to look at how when we put our hope in Christ, it is always going to lead us to joy. And so we're going to continue in John chapter 16. We're going to kind of skip down. Yesterday we looked at verse 16 and kind of saw this message that Christ had given. It was kind of confusing. I'm sure it was confusing to the disciples and even us today. Sometimes we could potentially even have some trouble with that verse, trying to understand exactly what Jesus was getting at. But he's actually going to repeat himself, and then he's going to say what he says here in verse 20, which is kind of the subject of our devotional today. Chapter 16 of John, in verse 20, it reads, "Truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn, but the world will rejoice. You will become sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn to joy." And so, again, we know that what Jesus is talking about is all a foreshadowing. As the disciples are hearing this, they're thinking, what is this guy talking about? What do you mean that we're going to be sorrowful? What do you mean that the world's going to rejoice at our weeping, at our pain? But what he's talking about is that in just a few hours after this conversation he's having with him, he was going to be arrested. And then very soon after that, he would be murdered. In all of the world, all of the world who was involved there in that, they were going to find so much joy in his death. They were going to look and say, man, he is a blasphemous agitator, right? He is a heretic. They're going to yell, crucify him. They're going to want him dead so much that they would have a known murderer freed so that Jesus would die on the cross. A person who is known to be guilty, to be removed from a just punishment so that a completely innocent man would take that punishment. And what a foreshadowing, right? We know that person is Barabbas, and we are Barabbas, aren't we? People who deserve a punishment, yet Christ takes our place. But in that moment, we know as he's foreshadowing this, he's prophesying really this to the people, to his disciples, telling them what's going to happen. And we know in that moment that it definitely came true. That as they watched their teacher, right, their Lord, they called him their Lord, as they watched their Lord crucified there on the cross, they were mourning and they were weeping and they were sorrowful, and the world around them took so much joy in their pain, because they didn't love Jesus. The world is naturally opposed to the gospel. But we know the rest of the story, don't we? We know that in 3 days he would be risen from the grave. We know that in that moment he not only defeats sin, but he also defeats death. And we know that he does that on our behalf. So he says, hey, in just a moment though, you will rejoice. And we can have that same rejoicing. The truth is, the world around us, just as they were opposed to the gospel, now they're opposed to the gospel today. They may find joy in our pain and in our mourning because of the sin that exists in the world and the sin that exists in our own lives. And so as we mourn over our sin and we mourn over the sin of the world laughs. The world rejoices in that. But what we have to remember is that if our hope is in Christ, then that mourning and that weeping and that sorrow is temporary. And I feel like we've talked about that for the last 3 weeks, but it is such an important truth that pain, that mourning is temporary. And so when the world looks at that and they laugh and they tell us that we are ridiculous and they tell us that our God is not real, we can still love them because we know they just don't see what we see. They haven't experienced Christ like we've experienced Christ. They don't know the joy that we have, the joy in knowing that while we may be losing the battle right now, it may feel like we're losing the battle right now. The truth is, not only are we going to win the war, we've actually already won. Before we were ever born, Christ defeated everything on our behalf. And we can have confidence in that. We can fully place our hope in that. And that can lead us to joy. I have a couple of questions here that our author gives us that I hope that you'll take a moment to work through. That'll kind of help us apply this. So the first question, when has someone found joy in your suffering, and how did it make you feel? And then our second question, how should we respond when others suffer? So what I hope you'll do is that you'll think about times when you've suffered and how the world responded, and that will lead you to empathy for those around us who are suffering. And my hope is that you'll know, hey, I need to take the joy of Christ to them. I need to take the hope that I have to them. And church family, as you are working that out, as you're figuring out how you can share that joy with others, and I hope that you are reveling in the idea that we have already won, that Christ has defeated all that was ever against us. As you are working and thinking through that, we want you to know that we love you and we're praying for you.